So there's something really important that we need to talk about when it comes to development, okay, and women in particular. And I say this because I know that there are a lot of young women in our community, okay. It is very important as a young woman, even amidst the world that we live in and all of the things that are happening, that you are able to reach a place of emotional maturity and psychological adulthood. And that requires us to be able to develop critical thinking skills. It also requires us to be able to examine ourselves honestly, okay, to confront our own capacity for harm, for good. We have to be willing to take responsibility and develop character. Ideally, character that is defined by integrity. Now, this isn't about being perfect, okay, but it is about being genuine, sincere, and earnest. And I think it is so important in a world whereby it is true that there are structural, systemic inequalities and injustices, and that actually, as women, we are a part of an oppressed class. That is absolutely true. You can feel it sometimes in the air, how palpable the fear that women collectively carry. And it's not in our imaginations. There are women of previous generations that we would have witnessed, observed, heard stories about. Today, we see news items every single day. You know of a friend maybe, who is, being abused, has lost her life potentially because she is a woman. We're talking about the some of the things in life that happen because we are a woman, okay, and the vulnerability and the exposure that comes with that. So it's understandable that we have fears. It's understandable that we collectively want to focus on how we can break free from, how systems can be changed to make life safer for women, for the human rights that we shouldn't have to beg, protest, okay, and lose our lives in the process of fighting for, how those human rights can be respected. And not only enshrined in law, but also in everyday life, in our interpersonal lives, we as women can live safer lives. Now, this should go without saying. And I recognize that a lot of people have come into my work and across my work from different places. And it's very true that I've only been sharing publicly in this manner for maybe 9, 10 months in total. It's very true that the majority of that work I did in the early months up until now, I've always talked about identifying invisible contracts, breaking invisible contracts, usually within the context of systems of power. Okay. And yes, a big part of that was male authority, whether that was religious male authority, political male authority, familial male authority. You've heard me talk about that quite a lot. But authority is still authority. And therefore, what I want to kind of invite you to consider is the fact that the way we as human beings who happen to be women think, the choices that we make, okay, matters as well. Even in a world where there is systemic injustice, the way we choose to use our own individual agency, the way and if we choose to learn how to think for ourselves is equally as important. And I recognize that this way of thinking is not always comforting or welcome, because it's not, I guess it's not activism-like, right? And some of there are other writers and thinkers who are exclusively focused on systemic injustice and inequality. Okay, they are exclusively focused on the political element of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a woman living today. Unpunishable Woman is really about how women can liberate themselves, often from invisible contracts, not just, okay, systemic contracts, but invisible internal contracts. You know, I get asked a lot, Ashanti, how have you gotten to this stage? How did you make some of these transformations? It wasn't solely, okay, from being able to observe and identify systemic injustice. It wasn't only from looking at the external. No, I started, and every day I start from the internal, from the I. How do I liberate myself mentally and psychologically and emotionally? That's where I start every day, because that is the sphere within which I have the greatest control. Right? And so an unpunishable woman is not really, okay, only about titillating your ears. Are there systemic issues that absolutely must be discussed? Yes. Does patriarchy and misogyny govern so much of our lives? Yes, it does. And within that, we have the choice, or we could choose, we could use our agency as individual women, as adult women. And I think particularly if you are a young woman, developing and forming right now, it is critical that you develop the ability to examine yourself and think about how you're choosing to use your agency. What kind of human being do you want to be? What do you want your character to be? Because actually, you can't hide behind intellectualism. You can't hide behind being a part of an oppressed group, where there may actually be some core things about your character and your humanity that you might need to be working on. And like I say, I'm not saying that we have to be perfect. Of course we don't. Because it's whenever I talk about character, psychological adulthood, ethical agency, when it comes to women, there is some pushback. And the pushback is very predictable at this point. It is, well, men do this. Or men are the ones who commit more violence than women. Bring out all of the empirical studies and stats. What does that still have to do with your individual agency? Now, I'm not denying context, okay? But here's the thing, I think adulthood, regardless of gender, requires more than just context. Yeah, that political, systemic, structural context. And that's why I asked the question, and I asked it publicly. I began that conversation. But it seemed like some were not ready for that conversation. We can't keep only looking at structural injustice and the things that men do and not be willing to look at the ways that we could be developing ourselves as women. And I think there is a risk of future generations of young women lacking in the ability to hold themselves accountable. Now, here's the thing. Because I have done a whole video where I talked about the difference between humiliation and accountability and shame, and the way shame is used as a tool to control and contain women. So hear me well here. I'm not talking about taking responsibility for things that don't belong to you. No, I'm talking about how you decide to develop as an individual woman who is coming into adulthood or who is an adult. Okay, this is about maturity. And what I found really interesting is that when I did that video about whether or not women are morally superior to men, the responses were very revealing. And I'm not talking about whether we all agreed, but even the responses that were really saying, what is the point of asking this? There's always a point of every adult human being, okay, thinking about how they show up, who they are as a human being. And I'm going to talk in a moment about the reason why this is even more important in the context of a matriarchy and what I observe online in terms of this discourse around matriarchy, because I've actually done quite a bit of research on the matriarchy and what anthropologists and certain scholars have said they believe it to be. And so it's very important that we do think about our character as women. how we use our agency, the agency that we are fighting to have recognized in these external spheres. Not least because whenever you've heard me talk about systems of power, what's one of the integral and first systems of power I talk about? The family. And ironically, the family as a system of power is the first system of power we are all introduced to, regardless of gender. And who is a part of that system of power? Who has authority in that system of power? Women. So we can talk about structural injustice and inequality. We can do that. We can talk about politics, healthcare, education. We can talk about all of that. But when it comes to the system of power that is family, that is a sphere within which women do have power and a degree of authority and influence over the development of children, regardless of gender. And so actually, it is definitely an important question to ask, because if we have women amongst us who genuinely believe that women are, because of biology, morally superior to men, that is a problem, especially if, for example, as citizens of the world, we are being asked to, encouraged to consider and invite a matriarchy. It does matter, because actually, regardless of who has authority and who has power, we should be looking at character, and we should be looking at the attitude we take to that character. So I was just scratching the surface with that question. And it isn't because actually my intention is to disprove or prove matriarchy. Either way, that's not it. What I'm asking are the questions that I believe we should be asking about what a matriarchal system would look like. And if we do not, as women, have the capacity, the willingness, or the ability to examine ourselves, and bear in mind here, I'm not, the funny thing is that, yes, the question asked was, are women morally superior to men? I asked that question because those are the comments and the statements that are often made in my comments. And bear in mind, I see thousands of comments a week at this point across YouTube, TikTok, Substack, Instagram, and then there are the emails that I receive and the DMs. So I do have a bit of a bird's eye view on this, and this is a recurring statement and or question that comes up. Hence, that was one of the reasons why I even decided to ask it and discuss it publicly. It is important, and I appreciate the fact that, look, it's not everything is about comparing women to men. I mean, if we're all apparently agreed, even on a casual basis, okay, that the bar is in hell when it comes to men's behavior, we can't live our lives as women constantly comparing ourselves to the bar being in hell. For me personally, I'm not comparing myself to that. I'm looking ahead and forward as to what I can pull myself towards in terms of my psychological development and the way I show up and function as a human being. And so never get it twisted. When it is important to think about who we are being as human beings who happen to be women, it's not always, and in fact, a lot of the time, men are irrelevant to me, insignificant. I don't live my life against that backdrop all of the time. No. So that question, and me asking that question, was not an attempt to be intellectually neutral or forgiving of men. It has nothing to do with them. An unpunishable woman is not always measuring herself by the lowest bar, the lowest common denominator. Right? It is important. And like I say, when you marry those two things, the family system where women are authoritative, where women do have influence. I used to be a DEI practitioner for many years. Okay, for many years, I would sell consulting, coaching, training to corporate organizations of all sizes all over the world. And I would say 90% of our work was always focused on inclusion in some kind of way, talent development, culture. I know all of the political arguments, right? I understand the pieces around, oppression, injustice, structure. I get all of that. It still doesn't change the fact that as individual women, especially if we are coming into adulthood, if we are already adults, we should be holding ourselves responsible for the way we show up and the way we behave. Period. And that doesn't need to be done under the glare and scrutiny of misogynistic men. It doesn't even have to come to that. When we're having these conversations together, it's not about comparing you to men or comparing women to structural power and the way that plays out in the world that we live in. Now, I appreciate that might be what you are invested in and that's what you're interested in. There are plenty of other platforms and communities that exclusively focus on that. Unpunishable Woman is not the one that will exclusively focus on that. Because one of the things I know for sure, in order to have any way of surviving this world, there is an internal sense of self that you have to be able to curate and generate, period. And that doesn't start by comparing yourself to men or the lowest common denominator within men, for starters. And we cannot attribute every single behavior and action to patriarchy and misogyny. Not all of it. Well, as human beings, we do have some agency. We do. Okay, and I think that it's not going to be helpful as we move forward. It's not helpful for younger generations of women because they will be immature emotionally, psychologically underdeveloped if they do not develop these kind of skills. You cannot hide behind intellectualism, degrees, the buzzwords. And when I say buzzwords, I'm not diminishing the importance of some of these. What I'm saying is it becomes a buzzword if on an individual level you are not developing certain characteristics and an ability to think for yourself, an ability to listen, to understand, and still disagree, by the way, because it's not about agreement at the end of the day. And I don't understand how, if we're going to be moving towards a place where people viably believe that matriarchy could be good for society, where women have more influence and a certain degree of power. Because, by the way, if you do the research, even when you look at the tribes and the communities that were being studied, there were still some disparities around power. So that would also need to still be reimagined in a future context. The point is, if we want women to have more power and influence, we should absolutely, as citizens of this world, be asking how they would use that power and describing some of the capacity for harm that women have, particularly within the family context, as fringe, unnecessary to discuss. I do not agree with that. I don't agree with that, and I think it's a very precarious road to start going down. Women are primary caregivers, generally speaking. Okay, and that is not only determined by biology. The assumption that because women have the capacity to give birth biologically, they are therefore safer people and care about children more than other people. If you are awake in the world that we're living in today, there's a lot of qualitative evidence that tells us that that might not actually be the case. And as women amongst us, this isn't about what men think, what they're seeing and how men feel. I don't care for that. But as women amongst us, we need to have the capacity and the willingness to talk about that. Because as a citizen of this world, you're asking me to vote and support and participate in a matriarchy. Well, those questions are going to need to be answered. Those are things that we're going to need to explore. And I do believe that a matriarchy to a great extent is being romanticized. Right? Because how does a matriarchy, how will it function and exist within the context of the world that still includes racism, sexism, classism? Those things are still going to exist. So how will we navigate that? Also, women are not a monolith politically, socially, culturally, morally. And I know that word is a kind of testy word for people, but we're not. So this, we do need to be having these conversations because actually not all women feel the same. Not all women have the same priorities, incentives, imperatives. So the ability and the willingness to develop character, understand how to exercise power responsibly, examine yourself honestly, okay? Don't outsource your conscience and your thinking faculties. Not hiding behind ideology. Because like I said, if you're awake and you're looking around, you might want to believe certain things about women, but actually there are plenty of examples that show us that there is still individual human character, behavior work to be done by women. Now, does that make women worse than men? It doesn't have to come to that. That doesn't have to be the conversation. And we can't constantly be saying, well, patriarchy, misogyny, so we don't need to talk about that. We don't need to think about that. No. Because I don't want to end up in a world where there are tyrannical women ruling. And you might scoff at that because you think that that's improbable, unlikely, or impossible. It is not. Because again, okay, when you research the communities it wasn't kumbaya for everyone. Abuse still occurred. Inequality still existed. So would it be different because it's women who have, and here's the thing. It is well known that it's the idea that no hierarchy at all would exist in a matriarchy. Human beings would have to fundamentally change the way we think, function, and behave for that to be true. Every single society has hierarchy, whether it's informal or otherwise. And so I do believe that some of us are romanticizing what a matriarchy could be. And all we need to do is be more open to doing the work on ourselves, number one, and two, having this conversation about that. That is important, especially if we say that we're child-centered and that a matriarchy would be, well, then we do need to require maturity, ethical maturity, emotional maturity from those of us, from all of us, regardless of gender. Now, is that an extra burden or pressure? I don't believe so. And this is how I aim to hold myself accountable. And so I had to think for a long time, actually, about the responses that I observed. And like I say, my issue wasn't that people disagreed with me, but it was deeper than that. I saw the invisible contracts at play around assumed female innocence, assumed female moral superiority, how female consensus as an authority can play out. I don't outsource my thinking or conscience to any ideology. No ideology has authority over the way I choose to think. I do not outsource my critical thinking skills, okay, to female consensus. No. Authority is authority. And where I've been encouraging you for the last 9 months to think about the way authority plays out in your life and the invisible contracts, okay, that govern your life, I'm not going to replace one authority with another. So you might be rejecting unearned male authority in whatever sphere of life and system of power. It should not be automatically replaced by female consensus under the guise of female solidarity. No. That in itself is an issue. Now, I understand that might feel or sound like a demanding ethic. But it applies, in my view, to women and men alike, to all genders. Because to me, integrity matters. Psychological health matters. And it applies to mothers, to fathers, to CEOs, to politicians, to pastors, to teachers, to activists, to partners. I don't care who it is. It applies to everyone. Okay, and as somebody who believes that women deserve to be understood and treated as complete human beings with dignity, agency, responsibility, that also means, okay, that I don't believe that all women are emotionally fragile, intellectually underdeveloped, and can't have what might be uncomfortable conversations. I don't think women are beyond questioning. Now, I understand that actually women don't want to consistently be questioned by men and systems of power. I get it. That's fine. Hence why I talk about invisible contracts, right? You've all heard me talk about that. The way women are questioned and encouraged to doubt themselves, to suspend their own reality, not trust their instincts and their guts. That is not the same as us choosing as adult women to look inside ourselves in terms of our character, our values, how we behave, how we see the world, how we show up in the world when we do have power and authority. That is not the same thing. I am not diminishing or stripping women of their dignity. I'm not being unkind. That's about psychological adulthood. And you know, I noticed that people think, well, no, we've got bigger fish to fry. Hold on a minute. We should focus on the things that men are doing wrong. We should focus on the things that the system. No, that is not how you adapt and survive in this world. Move into psychological adulthood. You see, when we're it requires maturity. And the thing is, we all live in a society, regardless of gender, okay, that has a culture of domination, of violence, of coercion, of power. Everyone is living within it. And so actually, we can all be affected by it, not just in terms of the way it treats us, but the way we begin indirectly, directly, inadvertently to embody some of those behaviors that are unhealthy, dysfunctional, and toxic. Me pointing that out, which by the way, I didn't come up with that, it's evidenced in the world that we live in today. It's evidenced in the world that we live in today. That is why I encourage you to privately reflect on the invisible contracts. And those invisible contracts are not always contextualized purely by the behavior of men. We are not animals. We have a conscience. We have the ability to reflect. And like I say, if you take the time to reflect in your own private time, sometimes it can save you from being publicly dragged. And when I say publicly, I'm not talking only about online behavior. I'm also talking about in your family, in your work, the ability to reflect and choose to, develop certain qualities and traits. And I'm sorry, we're raising women who want to become mothers, who will raise the next generation of women. And you might think that that's trivial or completely unrelated, but it is not. It is not. And so, yeah, you might have heard me say, well, women need to be more accountable for the decisions that we make and some of the harm that we are capable of and the harm that we do demonstrate. And you may have heard some other man who said that before. I mean, obviously, they don't even use those words when they talk about women need to be accountable. I'm not talking about the context of man-woman relationship. I'm not talking about that. See, not everything is about relationships and romantic relationships between men and women. I'm talking about how we show up as women in our capacity as mothers, as friends, as sisters, cousins. It matters. And not every unhealthy, dysfunctional behavior that we exhibit as women can be attributed to patriarchy. Not every behavior can the rebuttal be, well, men do this, they do it at a bigger scale, at higher proportions. No. When you look at all of the videos, especially the ones that I talk about the invisible contract of sex and marriage, every single one of them is about a woman relocating her authority and taking responsibility of the way she thinks and what she chooses. We can sit here all day and talk about the things that men do and the way they're conditioned and socialized. We can do that. But what does that do for you? We can have those conversations. We can all appear to be smart. We can bring out all the theories, the feminist theories. But at the end of the day, when it's just you in your home at nighttime, how is that going to impact how you choose to show up when you choose to have children? The mother that you are becoming, the sister that you're being. So actually, it is always relevant to examine how we're thinking. We can't keep comparing ourselves to the lowest common denominators. And so what I will say is this, one of the things that I'm really looking forward to doing over the next several weeks is publicly sharing the research that I'm doing on matriarchal societies, and publicly asking more questions about what this would actually look like. What could life be like for everyone in society, much less women, if this were to come to pass? Because I've seen a real uptick and rise, especially amongst younger women, of describing themselves as matriarchies, of saying that we need a matriarchy. I'm not convinced that people really understand what a matriarchy is. and or have asked necessary questions about what that means for society. How would that actually play out? And any political system that is being proposed should be able to withstand scrutiny. And inevitably, it is human beings who run systems of power. And so it makes complete sense to think about and ask questions about the integrity of the human beings who want to be a part of those systems. Now, I don't know if a matriarchy will come in my lifetime. I'm 37. Who knows? So that tells me that potentially it's future generations who are. And I do think we do them a disservice. Okay, when we only contextualize womanhood in the lens of victimhood, oppression, and emotional fragility. That is not power. That is not authority. That's not reclaiming your authority. And actually, what can happen is some really unhealthy things when it comes to people who then, who are in positions of power in society. That is not unique to men. That is a human thing. And arguably, when you look at the system of power that is family, we see that very clearly. When we look at the well-being of children and the way society treats. This is the thing when I hear people talk about the fact that society does not prioritize children. Who is part of this society? Women as well. Who we choose to become as adult women will impact the kind of mothers we become. Let's put aside the fact that we choose the men that we have children with for the most part in this day and age. So it does matter. There's generations of younger women who may want to reimagine and restructure society and might be looking at a matriarchy as a model of some sort. Well, who they choose to become and how they're thinking absolutely matters. Now, I appreciate that if you only, for example, are listening to me through this platform that you're listening to me on, you may not have come across some of my other work on Substack, okay, or on TikTok. And so you're not always seeing the full breadth necessarily of what I share. So here's what you need to understand at the moment, okay, is that what I will be doing as I start inquiring about the matriarchy and what a matriarchy actually is, what it could be, what questions we probably need to be asking ourselves as women about it, I will be sharing on Substack. Now, this is going to require discipline from me as well, because I want to be able to share all of the sources, any reading that I'm coming across. So what I will be doing is keeping this kind of evergreen, living kind of record on Substack. All right, so I would encourage you to go over to Substack and subscribe if you want to be able to connect to any of the sources or the reading items that I mention as I begin to share this series on the matriarchy that I'm doing. Okay, it's going to require discipline from me as well to do that. Right? Because I'm not going into it to disprove or prove matriarchy. What I'm saying is that as citizens of the world, I believe women have the capacity to ask these questions. We can have these conversations. We need to be talking about it in more realistic terms, not just as this fantasy or an affirmation on a sticky note that gets stuck on your mirror while you're doing your 10-step cleansing routine. No, because actually it will have real world impact on everybody. And I think there are some fundamental questions that we are not asking and that it seems to me sometimes we're avoiding. And I saw that in the response to a simple question that, by the way, I didn't come up with. It's a question that appears quite often in my comments. It's a comment that appears that women are fundamentally morally superior to men. Well, if that is the case, then what can we reasonably expect from a matriarchy then? And then what I hear back is, well, no one's perfect. It's not going to... Okay, then why are we starting from the point that women are morally superior? Do you see what I mean? It doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't have to be that binary. So what I would encourage you to do is go over to Substack and subscribe, because I will be starting that matriarchy inquiry series where I ask a question, we look at what the evidence is so far, and what other questions arise, what questions are still unanswered. And then I would encourage you also to think about the fact that, look, to be an unpunishable woman, this is not a political movement. It is this is about the individual human work you can choose to do on yourself as a woman. And so at times we'll talk about systems as context, but a lot of the time actually we're going to be talking about what is within our gift. What is within our individual internal gift in terms of the way we're thinking, and then the decisions that we make, the behaviors that we exhibit. And it's not just about freeing yourself, as it were, from from only men. There's more to life than men. There really is. There's more to life than a man and what he thinks.